Hello, everybody. It's me again, coming at you today with another tier video. Today, we're going to be talking about Metalcore Legends Converge. I've been talking about them a lot this past year on the podcast. I've gotten really into these guys. They've sort of had music that's been in my life. I've been following them ever since their most recent album, The Dusk In Us, was released. I have been a fan ever since. We talked about potentially doing B-sides for these guys over the past few months, but the thing is that we're not sure what things are going to qualify for doing B-sides from now on, since we have the retrospective series. We're kind of exploring different avenues for covering entire discographies now. That said, even when Converge was brought up as an idea, is that, it's a band that a lot of us care about an awful lot. But the thing is about them is that with metalcore and core genres in general, is that it's very hard to continually keep saying new things about them, to keep saying, like, you really have to hone in on what makes these records different from one another, in a way that might not be conducive to group discussion, just because a lot of what Converge does is broadly kind of similar on an album by album basis, especially in those earlier records. But that's not to devalue them. That's just really speaking more to the consistency and longevity of this band that I love a whole lot. And I am going to rank their discography today. This little tier maker thing has two EPs that are included in the band's catalog, just like with Porcupine Tree. Not going to be going over those, just doing main studio album releases. And yeah, let's do this. First album here we're going to be talking about is the 1994 debut, Halo in a Haystack. This is a curious album. Depending on where you look, this might not even technically count as a canon Converge record. And when you listen to the album itself, that kind of doubt is sort of brought to the surface even further, because take one listen to pretty much any song on here and it's very evident that this is more or less a compilation of very crudely recorded demos. And it's probably more of a proof of concept for the band to just kind of get themselves out there. We've covered albums like Sing the Gray's Frightened Rabbit's first technical studio release, which is not really a canon release from the band, and this is kind of in that avenue. And so I hadn't actually heard this because it wasn't on streaming services, so I kind of tempered my expectations because I've been living with the rest of their discography for a while, and I know that this is not typically considered to be a great album. And I just sort of went in being like, yeah, this is probably going to be like a demo kind of thing, so yeah, just open-minded. And oh, yeah, I'm not going to lie, this is rough. This is really rough, even for a debut. The songs here, some of them barely even feel like songs. I mean, there's just no structure to some of these. Yes, they're crudely recorded, and that can kind of fall in line with the whole hardcore punk aesthetic. But with what Converge does, you just need a little bit more oomph behind your sound. And it sounds like there was just no effort to record this in a way that feels energetic, or in a way that feels like pronounced. Everything sounds like it's in a cave, and all of the songs are just, they're drafts, they're barely there. And I'm sure that this was a necessary step for the band. I'm not really sure if there's a story behind this particular record, but just as an entry into this entire body of work, while it may have been a necessary step, it is not a necessary step to reflect and listen on for the band, as it's just, it's so far away from the rest of their work in terms of quality that there's not even anything you can really draw from it and like, oh, this is where they came from. It's like some of this stuff sounds like they're tuning their guitars in some respects. So it's really rough. it's not good even when you temper your expectations. I think it's just genuinely it borders on being unlistenable, quite frankly. It's not very good at all. I would probably put this in a F tier or E tier if this particular tier list allowed me, but it is going to confidently go into the bottom, the D tier over here. Okay, 2 years later, we have Petitioning the Empty Sky. This is their follow up, really more of their proper introduction to the musical world. And I gotta say, I mean, again, I know you can barely even really consider it a full step forward with the first record, but the difference in quality here is astonishing. Petitioning the Empty Sky for a very long while was what I considered to be my favorite Converge album. And it's not because it does anything particularly fancy. It's not because it's the most musically complex. It's not even necessarily the hardest they would even go. However, it is just ruthless. This is very meat and potatoes metalcore, even by this band's standards. But the real way in which it shines, I think, is just solely by the fact that the band feels like they are performing these songs like they would never get to perform music ever again. And the opening, The Saddest Day, is one of the best Converge songs. This is an album that is like truly unhinged. And while I said it wasn't the heaviest they would go, I would say the vocals maybe like kind of verge on being some of the most like manic and feverish and downright kind of scary. Uh, Again, The Saddest Day, one of the best Converge songs ever. Um, it's definitely, I won't say it takes a dive after that song. It's kind of a longer song, and the record overall is kind of short. But noticeably, there's a couple songs on here that don't really reach that same height. But then again, they don't really dip in quality. Everything here is really, really, really solid stuff. Um, it is definitely, this is like the most necessary early album of theirs to look at, I think. But it's just done with like confidence and youth. And, maybe if you're into the more technically refined entries in this discography, it's not really going to tickle your fancy. But as somebody who just really likes to hear the passion of a really young band who's, dabbling in a very particular sect of extreme music, it's an incredibly satisfying listen. I genuinely do think that maybe while not one of the best records in this discography, it is certainly contains a lot of highlights and a lot of great foundational work. And I would honestly put it in the A tier. It's a terrific record, and I don't really think that it gets its due. There's a lot of entries in this discography that kind of overshine others, but this is one that definitely needs more attention from other people. If you're sort of into that really, really that core, like the really, really stripped back stuff, but the production doesn't really let it down either. Okay, 2 years later, right after 1996, 1998, we have When Forever Comes Crashing Down here. And When Forever is definitely a step forward when it comes to complexity. The technicalities of metalcore music is pretty much the blueprint that a lot of bands live and die by, and as such, you can't come out with an album like Petitioning the Empty Sky and just keep doing that over and over and over again. It's why that record has so much novelty to me, is because Converge didn't do that. They instead went on to try and grow their sound a little bit. They try to hit more of a groovier side of their sound, more of a songs that have a bit more structure to them, a bit more polish without kind of trading in that really, really rough aesthetic. And this is an album that's definitely a lot more robust when it comes to its song lengths and the overall album structure. It feels like a really, really big proper introduction to the world of music, whereas Petitioning kind of had that feel of did sort of have that feel of a debut, even though it wasn't. But Win Forever, I think, is a very good record. It's a very, very solid release. It definitely has songs like The High Cost of Playing God, The Lowest Common Denominator, Year of the Swine, and the fucking amazing closer, Love is Arson. It's terrific, honestly. It's 40 minutes of really, really solid work. But in my opinion, this is a transitional record. The growing that they did was growing that, you know, they didn't nail out of the gate. It wasn't something that they just sort of instantly perfected. It was something they had to struggle with a little bit. As a result, this album's sound is comparatively a little bit more tame than Petitioning the Empty Sky. And that's not this album's fault, technically speaking, but when you're growing and you're doing all of these important things as a band, and like you're trying to refine sort of the more definite parts of your personality as a sound, when you make big strides later and perfect that sounds, it sort of makes earlier records that are transitional feel a bit extraneous when it comes to the rest of the discography. And I can't lie, this does definitely, in my opinion, suffer from that because it doesn't really hit any of the extremities that a lot of their other records do. It is very, very quintessential in understanding where they would go from this point forward. But in my opinion, it's an album that definitely does feel its growing pains a little bit. It's a very solid release, though. I would put it in the B tier. Definitely check it out. If you haven't, you could gel with it a little bit more than me. But they're, you know, it's one of the neglected albums in this discography, and a little bit unfairly so, in my opinion. Okay, and here this is like a split EP that they did with another metalcore band, Agoraphobic Nosebleed, in 1999. But 3 years later, after When Forever Comes Crashing Down came out, we have, of course, Jane Doe. Jane Doe is often considered to be Converge's best record, one of the best metalcore albums ever, if not the best, and just sort of a landmark in extreme music. And I can't really find myself disagreeing with a lot of the cultural assessments of the importance of this album. It's when Converge finally came into their own. While I may really love the youthfulness of Petitioning the Empty Sky, there is definitely a refined maturity here that is also backed up by the fact that it also goes really fucking hard. So it doesn't really suffer in the same way that When Forever does. But yeah, this is an incredible fucking record. It starts off amazingly well with songs like a little sort of intro of Concubine, going straight into Fault and Fracture, has some of my favorite Converge songs on here, like Phoenix in Flight and Thaw, and the title track, the end, Jane Doe, is easily top five material from the band. There's not a moment on this album where you are not convinced that everyone is putting their best foot forward. It is a remarkably consistent achievement. That said, I'm not going to talk any shit on Jane Doe, so you know, don't come after me or anything. But in the canon of the band, I think it's definitely a little bit more culturally important than necessarily important to the band's narrative as musicians, like divorced from that. This is an album that still does feel like it's a little rudimentary for them. It's them definitely taking everything and turning it up to 11 rather than adding some of the bells and whistles that would make some of their later albums a little bit more interesting. Jane Doe is an album that really only has one mode. And while metalcore albums typically do explore that one mode, I like how their sound progresses a lot more from here. This is sort of the blueprint that they use going forward. And as a result, it keeps it from being the tippy top of the discography for me, in that it is worthwhile for all of the reasons that I already said it was, but it's also something that I feel just drastically overshadows some of their work that is a little bit more technically refined and a little bit more ambitious. But it's not to downplay the importance of the record. It's a terrific album. It's actually a really good place to start. I personally would start with Petitioning the Empty Sky, just because it'll, like, you can sort of feel a little bit less of the novelty of the album and then go straight into Jane Doe. But yeah, I would put this in the A tier. It is a classic for a reason, and I like it a great deal, even if it is not my favorite Converge album. Okay, and again, 3 years later, afterwards, we have You Fail Me. You Fail Me is considered to be a very good album. It's sort of one of the higher ranking, like the higher rated albums in the band's discography. And if you know anything about me, you'll know that I definitely agree. You Fail Me, in my opinion, right now is the pinnacle of Converge. It's when they started to branch out and experiment with their sound a little bit more and stopped being just a metalcore band and sort of knew how to rein it in. The structural refinements from Jane Doe really show their head here, and also it goes just as hard, if not even harder. The sort of opening stretch of those first 7 tracks are just absolutely unfucking beatable. I would probably say that this is my favorite metalcore album ever recorded. And there's also, like, Jane Doe is a particularly bleak record. A lot of entries in this discography in this genre are not exactly happy. We just reviewed Counterparts a few weeks back on the show, and that is sort of like very emblematic of where this sort of sound dabbles in thematically. But You Fail Me is, I think, even darker than Jane Doe. Personally, you sort of feel that there's this, like, there's a little bit more emphasis on the lyrical content here, which, you know, again, metalcore not really known for doing that. I mean, you can listen to Petitioning the Empty Sky and ignore the lyrics entirely, and the appeal is not lost on you. But You Fail Me is definitely born out of a lot of darkness because after they were sort of done with Jane Doe and touring for Jane Doe, frontman in a couple of interviews talked about how arduous of a process it was to make new music after this. They'd sort of pushed themselves to the limit of the first phase of their career. And as a result, they kind of suffered a little bit of burnout and a lot of problems with depression. A lot of times things weren't going particularly well for them, and that was sort of channeled into You Fail Me. There's like a really distinct defeatism, and the sort of thematic content of the album is about sort of the strong people in, I guess, in society in general, preying on that of the weak. It's shown beautifully in songs like Eagles Become Vultures, which is one of my favorite Converge songs, if not even my favorite. But it also has moments of real show-stopping beauty. You have songs like the almost ballad-esque In Her Shadow, and songs like Hanging Moon. It is utterly perfect to me. There is one tiny little caveat in that I do think it is a perfect album, but there are 2 versions of this. There's the original recording, and then there's the Redux. To my knowledge, the Redux album was produced by the guy who did the production of their later albums, some of their 2010 stuff. And as a result, the Redux sounds a lot more like those albums. And in my opinion, the Redux is the better version. The original version is not bad. It's fucking great, and you should listen to it, but it's a bit like the Tom Waits remaster of Real Gone, where it's like, on the one hand, you have the rawer and edgier and just a little bit more frenetic and frenzied approach to recording on one, which sort of maintains that kind of spirit in which it was recorded. But then you have the cleaned up version of the album, like I think it's called the Redux, where yes, it has some of that gritty edge of it sanded off, but as a result, the instrumentation itself feels a little bit more full. It feels like it hits with more impact, and for me, that's what I look for when this record in particular. So I would recommend that version. But yeah, this, in my opinion, is the best Converge album, and I would put it in the S tier because honestly, it's just kind of unmatched, at least for the time being anyway. But it's an album that gets a little overshadowed just because Jane Doe came out and sort of, that's the Converge record, and everything after that just kind of, in the 2000s period, just kind of got swallowed by its shadow, which is a shame because there's a lot to love about some of these records, especially this one. But yeah, this is absolutely terrific. Another 2-year gap, and then we have 2006's No Heroes. No Heroes is a pretty well-regarded album, when all things are considered, basically on the same level as Petitioning and Win Forever, kind of have similar aggregate scores. And if I'm being honest, if I discounted the debut, No Heroes here would probably be my least favorite Converge album. It is a very good record. In many respects, it is a great record. And I definitely know why this is a lot of other people's favorite, is because this is a wild and unruly album. Like they are really, really pushing themselves performance and structurally wise. Like this album has like it switches up on a dime. Some of these songs just don't obey a structure at all, and that's kind of the double-edged sword, kind of the weakness of it for me, is that you have these sort of shorter songs that really don't have a lot of development, especially in the first half of the record. Like those first 5 songs are all around like 1 minute, and they just kind of bounce back and forth from idea to idea, and I never really have time to settle myself with it. It just kind of goes in one ear and out the other occasionally. I think the back half of the record really picks up. No Heroes, the title track, is fucking outstanding. And there are moments like on the 8th track that is almost 10 minutes long where it just sort of feels like you're being bounced on a pinball machine and you really don't have much to latch onto. But this is still an album that's a bit of a wild card. It may work for you just because of how far they go when it comes to playing with the conventions of their own music. For me, I like it to be a little bit more tighter. I like to find a balance between the chaotic nature of it and between the how just kind of heavy it is. And this definitely leans towards one side more than the other, but it could be a sound that you really, really love. But as a result, for me, it does suffer a little bit by comparison, especially knowing that it is sort of sandwiched between 2 albums that I deem to be like great. So yeah, this is a very, very good album. I would put it on the same level as When Forever Comes Crashing Down. I put it in the B tier. It's a very, very good record. And just because it's my least favorite of like the proper Converge records doesn't mean that you should skip over it. It's well worth your time. Okay, another 3-year gap this time, and we have Axe to Fall. Axe to Fall, to me, really that sort of 3-year gap being kind of essential, is this feels like No Heroes, but given that sort of extra time to gestate and grow sound-wise. And as a result, this is kind of a summation of their 2000s discography, or at least their summation of their career post Jane Doe. And as a result, uh, I think it's probably my favorite album that they released in this particular decade. I think Axe to Fall is a refinement in every way, and I would say that I even slightly prefer it to Jane Doe. Because it sort of takes those structural leanings that No Heroes was trying to go for, but also just kind of the band is a little bit more experienced. They know where they're going. I said it was my favorite in the decade after I talked about You Fail Me, so that's not true. Good job, words. They're good. But you can tell that the albums sort of behind the band that were them sort of building their identity have allowed them to truly indulge in experimentation without it suffering from being transitional anymore. And yeah, Axe to Fall is just an incredibly consistent record. There's not a moment of this that I don't find super enthralling, super engaging. It's just sort of like, in many ways, it's kind of like a spiritual successor to Petitioning the Empty Sky, which, it was shorter, it was a little bit more unkempt, but this sort of retains a kind of ruggedness that I really love. So it's kind of No Heroes fully realized, in my opinion. It was a great note to go out on in 2009, and while I deem You Fail Me to be the best album there, I think this is a solid second place. I'm going to put Axe to Fall in the A category. While it doesn't really have any identifiable weaknesses, I just also would say that it doesn't do everything quite as well as You Fail Me does, but that's basically marginal. It's a difference between a 9 and a 10. Okay, after that, we go straight into another 3-year gap, and we find All We Love, We Leave Behind, my first Converge album that I ever listened to. And in many ways, it was probably not a great place to start just because it doesn't really give you an idea of what this band is sort of an emblematic sense. And it wasn't until I revisited the early parts of their discography where I really developed an appreciation for this. I liked it when it came out, not when it came out, when I first listened to it, but I didn't properly understand it. As a result, I find, even though there was only 2 Converge albums released in the 2010s, I find this to be the most interesting era of their career, mainly because it's them sort of like once they did X to Fall, it was like, this is as far as we can take this. This is us perfecting a part of our sound, and now we're going to try to truly experiment. And as a result, there's kind of a post-hardcore vibe on these 2 albums. There's definitely genre leanings. There's moments of where you take it slower, where the production sort of changes from being this kind of assaultive metalcore to being something that feels a little bit more robust, a little bit more holistic. These albums are weird. They take you on a journey that's very unexpected. It's not as linear as the albums that came before it, but as a result, All We Love We Leave Behind, that 3-year gap, man, that's just sort of the recipe, I think, with Converge for them to really build upon their sound, and they did here. As it basically, I mean, if you want to nitpick it, it doesn't really sound anything like anything they've made up until this point. But I think the most notable step up here is the lyrics. The lyrics sort of have been burgeoning on being a little bit more important ever since Jane Doe. And here, this is where things become a little bit more prominent in the mix. You can kind of understand it. There's even kind of hooks on this album. And it gets into some darker thematic and even kind of ambitious territory, and it really sets the stage for the direction they would go in. And as a result, I do think this is one of the band's best releases. It is very, very tight. It is very, very well formed. It's not a great place to start if you want to know, like, if you want to get a good idea of what the band is. But if you're just looking for a good entry in this band's discography, it's hard to ignore because this is pretty accessible. It's probably more accessible than a lot of their early work. So again, maybe not the best place to start, but also not a bad place to start. But I love this album a great deal. I would put it near the top. I would say I'd put it in the tippy top of the A tier right here. And now, 2017, 5 years later. Biggest gap in between releases for them, we have the Dusk in Us, currently the most recent record. Really, really, really love this album a whole lot. I have liked it since I heard it, but again, it's kind of one of those things where I listened to their whole discography and sort of made me appreciate it more, as the more interesting leanings that they were experimenting with on All We Love kind of finds a fully formed identity here. There's a lot more, like, the songs are still distinctly metalcore, but there's a distinct, almost progressive edge to a lot of the structuring. It feels kind of like a post-hardcore album in a lot of ways. And the lyricism too on this is unfucking paralleled. There's just a really dark, kind of abyssal sense of isolation and loneliness, and even politics wise, they sort of lean into stuff that, punk bands have always criticized, specifically the closer Reptilian, which I think reads pretty blatantly as a criticism of the Middle East and the US's foreign policy. Not to say that it gets bogged down in that kind of thing, because that song fucking goes. But yeah, this to me is sort of the apex of the band's experimentation. Its mixing is a little bit more brittle, just because I feel like there's a fragility to it. There's a tension, there's an anxiety here. It's fucking ridiculous. It has my favorite Converge song on it, which is the title track, The Dusk in Us. It's a 7-minute opus. It sort of builds in like a really kind of quiet, like really devastating kind of way. And it builds to these crescendos, which are just fucking enormous. And that sort of edge just kind of carries over to here. But if you're looking for something that goes hard, you will basically, you could look in many worse places. Songs like Wildlife and I Can Tell You About Pain are just some of the best unapologetic thrashers of their career. There are days where this becomes dangerously close to being my favorite Converge album. I think I still usually steer in the direction of You Fail Me, but this to me is so emblematic of their entire career because it mixes just about everything. It pushes their sound forward, and I don't really have any problems with it at all. I think it's a perfect album, and I'm going to place it in the S tier. That is about it. Tell me what you all think of this band. Tell me what you think of Converge, how you would rank the albums. If I missed anything, if you disagree, if you agree, let me know in the comments below. Hopefully I will see you all soon with another tier video. So, sayonara.